with stand-up comedy. Maria Smith and Phineas Harper were curators for the Oslo Architecture Triennale last year, and the theme was degrowth. And the simple and brilliant idea behind that is it's not done by collapse, it's done by design. Today they are here because they bring new meaning or even new life to the idea that less is more. Please welcome Maria Smith and Phineas Harper.
Thank you.
Hello. Pro tip, if you don't want to use the plastic water glasses, just put the water in one of the ceramic coffee mugs instead. Ingenious stuff. Hello, I'm Finn.
And I'm Maria, and this is a talk about the climate emergency, architecture, and infinite, endless economic growth.
But first, a little bit of time travel. We're going to try something that we've not done in a lecture before, and ask you to close your eyes. Nothing too scary is going to happen. We're just going to play you a 2-minute audio piece, and as you hear the voices in the piece, try and listen to the statements that they're making and ask yourself where you think the truth lies. So, eyes closed.
But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy!
There are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
Los movimientos sociales son antiimperialistas, anticapitalistas, antineoliberales.
There are physical limits to growth. If we continue to ignore them and instead base our short-term policies on the assumption of continued growth, we'll overshoot those limits and collapse.
You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular.
I mean, since when was GDP a sensible measure of human welfare? And yet everything that governments want to do is to try to boost GDP.
Nothing in nature grows forever. We urgently need financial, political, and social innovations that enable us to overcome this structural dependency on growth.
We've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism and overthrow.
Today, Mr. Speaker, this House must declare an environment and climate emergency. We have no time to waste.
There are no limits to growth, and there are no limits when men and women are free to follow their dreams. No limits, no limits when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
Okay, welcome back to the present. That was about 40 years of political and economic history condensed into 2 minutes there. Did you recognize any of the voices? Margaret Thatcher, Greta, Ronald Reagan? Good. So I guess this is where the curtain opens on tonight's talk, a society which understands there is a climate emergency, that knows it needs to act, and yet somehow is still paralyzed, in part by this commitment to the idea that there are just no limits on growth, to human imagination, to culture, to the economy, and even to architecture.
So what has decades of limitless growth given us in terms of architecture? Well, not imposing limits on the construction industry has left us with a bit of a problem on our hands, as we now work in an industry contributing an incredible 40% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. So that's architects. Architecture is 40% of this problem. And we have particular culprits, domestic gas boilers, exacerbated by poorly insulated homes, commercial building services, concrete, and steel. So we talk about things like improving insulation, naturally ventilating our commercial buildings, cement replacement in concrete, and the recycling of steel. But all of these initiatives have all been under the heading of building more homes, more offices, more cultural buildings. So although we're building a little bit more efficiently, the overall energy use and carbon emissions associated with the built environment has continued to grow. Now, our governments believe that to address the increasing energy demand and tackle these excessive emissions, we need to develop new technologies. They tell us that smart cities are the answer, and they look to inspire investment in smart technologies through images that look like this. And this.
Yummy.
Are you inspired?
Delicious.
And this. And my personal favorite, this. Who doesn't want to live on an iPad? But why? Why do we... Why are we being fed this sort of imagery? Well, because if new technology is what we need, then the path to success is more investment in tech startups, more incentives for big technology companies, all of which can yield that holy grail of more economic growth.
They don't want to hear that maybe we already have the technology.
They don't want to hear we already have the technology, because if we have the technology, then we don't need to plow money into these growth-stimulating tech unicorns. Well, maybe the thing is that it's tempting, if you only have a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. And perhaps if we try to solve every problem with economic growth, we may not succeed. But this focus on solutions from new technology has translated into a focus on the operational energy use, and therefore carbon emissions, of our shiny new buildings. But as we can see from this graph that breaks down the carbon emissions associated with the built environment into the operational carbon of existing buildings, the big pink chunk in the middle, the green chunk, which is the embodied carbon, so the upfront carbon associated with new buildings, and then plug loads, so appliances with a plug, then we can see that a huge amount of the problem is the operational carbon of existing buildings, and another big chunk is that embodied carbon of new buildings. And if we only focus, as the smart city perpetuators would like us to, on the operational carbon of new buildings, we're only looking at that little purple slither there. And that's obviously not going to get us anywhere near far enough in this fight against decarbonizing the built environment. So no, we need to reduce the energy demand of existing buildings through big retrofit schemes like this Energy Sprong scheme from the Netherlands. And we need to reduce the embodied carbon of new buildings, which is where some of those traditional technologies start to come in. So embodied carbon, and I'm not sure what it is in Swedish, I'm sorry, is the carbon emissions that take place during the manufacture and construction of buildings. So from extracting the materials, and this is for concrete, processing those materials, transporting them, mixing them, all of those emissions that happen before day one, before we've turned on any of the heating or air conditioning services. So, for example, this is a project that I completed last year, and it's the refurbishment of an old factory that became 66 new homes. And as part of the project, we had to put in a new timber structure, lots of partitions, secondary glazing, and so on. And so we calculated the embodied carbon associated with this sort of deep retrofit scheme by taking the volume of every single material involved in this project and then multiplying that by its sort of global warming potential, which is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent per sort of meter cubed of that material, added them all up, and this is what we see as the result. So the total embodied carbon of that project is just under 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which works out at about 350 kilograms of carbon dioxide per square meter. So it emitted that just under that 2,000 tons. That's the same amount that it would emit in the first 25 years in use. So day one, 25 years worth of emissions. And this is why it's so important that we start considering embodied carbon. If we need to reduce our carbon emissions by sort of 2030, then we're emitting more than 25 years worth on day one. We really, really must start tackling this now under this immediate initiative. So where is all of that embodied carbon? Well, The Hoover building, that was a refurbishment, so 355, it's not brilliant, but it's not too bad. It's about a third of the average for new construction, which is about a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And much of that is in the structure. So you can see here, this is a study from the Institute of Structural Engineers in the UK, looking at different building types, offices, hospitals, schools. And you can see, no matter what we're looking at, 50 to 60% of that is covered from the substructure and superstructure. And a big part of this, of course, is concrete and steel. So we really need to rethink the building materials that we're using, and therefore, the kind of architecture that we create. So most of us have probably grown up and been educated to think that this is sexy.
Very sexy.
Pretty sexy.
So sexy.
And I'm not saying it's not sexy, but it is problematically sexy, because the sort of modernism and all of that kind of beautiful international style is built up on inherently high carbon materials. And if we're to design a new kind of architecture fit for a climate emergency, we need to adjust a little bit what we think of as sexy. The kind of inherently low carbon materials like earth, like cob, unfired bricks, like straw bales, like hempcrete, all of these materials that are much, much lower carbon are also much weaker. And so they engender a different kind of architecture. So maybe we need to sort of go back to lusting after big, fat, pudgy, stereotomic, squishy buildings. And there is a lineage for this. We do think this is sexy as well, and we think that Louis Kahn's pretty sexy. We think Olgiati is pretty sexy. Peter Zumthor, pretty sexy. But we need to look at achieving these things not in concrete, as we have been, but in these inherently low-carbon materials. And this is a particularly frustrating example because it's very beautiful, but it's rammed concrete. And so we're using this very, very high-carbon material to realize an aesthetic that is actually inherently low-carbon. And if we start to make this shift, then this is a really exciting time for architecture to develop a new style and develop a new kind of design ethic and design aesthetic around these low-carbon materials. So this is just one example. This is a rammed earth vault by Martin Rach in Switzerland. Just an illustration of the kind of exciting new forms and exciting new innovations that we might see with these old technologies.
So why don't we build like this, right? Because clearly we used to. There was a time when pudgy buildings were just buildings, and that was really great. To answer that question, let's explore the story of this ordinary piece of limestone. Right? It has a compressive strength of 100 newtons per millimeter squared. Pretty good bit of stone. But we don't use it like that. Instead, we dig it up, we crush it up, we turn it into cement and concrete. That's a process that takes an extraordinary amount of energy, right? Grinding, heating, sintering, quenching, granulating, blending. Before you've even started to cast it, go into making concrete and cement. A cement kiln, which is those sort of horizontal cylinders, will be at a temperature of well over 1,000 degrees. You end up with this, a similar material, except now it has a compressive strength of 40 newtons per millimeter squared.
So all that energy and all that carbon has gone into making a material that is weaker. Why on earth are we doing this?
Well, here's the thing. Concrete has a higher carbon footprint because more processes go into making it. But from an economic point of view, that is a good thing, right? In an economy that wants to grow, the more processes you have, the more opportunities you have for trade. And the more opportunities for trade you have, the more economic activity takes place. And that is what you are measuring when you are measuring economic growth. So in a society that always wants to grow the economy, simple materials like stone gradually disincentivized and fall out of use. Complex, energy-intensive materials like concrete gradually incentivized, and a huge industry builds up around processing these high-carbon materials. And that impulse to always grow the economy doesn't just affect the material choices that we make, it affects the kind of buildings we design. This is the original concept sketch for Stansted Airport by Norman Foster. And the idea is ingenious. You bury the baggage handling underground, and then passengers get this kind of unencumbered big shed that they can simply wander through to get on their plane. A very simple, relaxing, calming building. This is what Stansted looks like today. They have built a new departures lounge. It is a kind of linear, undulating hellscape of Toblerone and Chanel No. 5, sucking passengers in and spitting them out the other end like effluent, draining their pockets and their spirit with an architecture that is all about maximizing opportunities for trade to take place through commerce and through architectural control. It is no coincidence that this kind of architecture resembles an intestinal tract, an organ that has evolved to suck, to suck the goodness out of everything that passes through it. So this desire for growth, it does weird things to architecture. It does weird things to the kinds of things that we design and what we design them from. And the purpose of this lecture is to challenge that impulse to always grow the economy and to maybe propose some alternatives. But before we do that, what on earth is economic growth and where did it come from? So, the first version of something a little bit like what we currently call GDP was invented in the 17th century by the English in order to invade Ireland, right? And this is a sort of theme we're going to come back to. So Oliver Cromwell wants to invade Ireland. He wants to take the land off the Irish people, but he can't afford to, so he raises money through loans, takes out loans. And he says to the people giving him money, I will give you a bit of Ireland in return for your loan. So needs a way to measure the kind of financial or economic value of this island that he's going to invade. And employs economists to kind of devise a system of calculating or expressing the value of regions of Ireland in economic terms. And that really is the precursor of what we still use to measure economic prosperity. GDP, gross domestic product, is just a measure of everything that is traded within a country.
So today, GDP is the basis of pretty much how every government measures societal success. Whoever you vote for, chances are you're voting for somebody who is trying to grow the economy, to increase GDP. And GDP growth is also how, currently, we're trying to save the planet.
Right, so this is Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who kind of popularized the idea of sustainable development in the 80s. And she said, what is needed now is a new era of economic growth, growth that is forceful and at the same time socially and environmentally sustainable.
But can it be done? Can something grow forever?
It's a good question. We need a volunteer from the audience.
Anyone an expert on infinite growth?
Anybody at all? Is there? I can't see. Is there someone coming up? Someone is coming up.
Hey! Give a warm welcome to our growth correspondent.
Okay, step into our portal of growth. Now, I'd like you to just blow that up just a little bit, just a little, teeny-weeny little bit. A little bit more. Oh, very nice. Hold it up so they can see what you've got. There we go. Is it on film?
Very nice, yeah.
Okay. Actually, that's not, maybe just a little bit more. A little bit more. Nice. A bit more, maybe? Just a bit more.
I mean, I feel like we can keep going.
Yeah, why not? No, keep some more.
Keep it up, yeah. More, right? Yeah.
Why have you stopped?
Yeah.
It's getting harder, right? Getting harder. Yeah, because, okay. Okay. I could take it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for poignantly failing there. That was very important.
In a finite system, it is easy to grow something for a little bit, but it gets harder. As you approach the limits of that system, you have to put in more energy to grow something by a smaller amount. And as we all know, and perhaps our volunteer sensed, if we went too far, the system would burst. In the long term, infinite economic growth is simply impossible, and that is a scientific and physical reality. But in the short term, we have a problem as well, because it turns out that there is a very close link between a growing economy and growing carbon emissions. In fact, the only time in the last few decades when carbon emissions on a global scale have come down is when the economy has come down as well. Now, don't get us wrong. This is not to say that economics is the problem, right? Economics is just a social science. What we are asking for is to simply be more critical about what an economy is for and what a good economy looks like. You can have many different kinds of economy. You could have a small economy. You could have a big economy. You could have a simple economy.
Even I could do that.
You could have a complicated economy.
Yeah, not up to that. Yeah.
The problem is that at the moment, our definition of a good economy is one that grows and grows and grows and grows until it reaches the edge of its limits and collapses. And this pursuit of GDP growth is not just bad for the planet. It's not just impossible in the long term. It is also bad for people. We see it all the time. We see it in poor labor conditions as employers exploit wage differences across borders. We see it in the reckless extraction of resources as speculators take increasing risks to continue growth. And we see it in the tightening of borders as xenophobic governments, rather than taking meaningful climate action, choose to tighten borders in fear of climate refugees.
So if we agree that growth is a problem, what does that mean for architecture?
Right. How can architecture move away from this model of highly carbon-intensive materials and designs that are good for growth but bad for the planet? How can it explore an alternative? What might an architecture of degrowth be like? Now, we've talked a little bit about weaning ourselves off kind of highly processed materials like concrete. But kind of one of the things that makes it hard to do that is that we like the way that concrete is very tough, it is very resilient. And in sustainable architecture, we hear this all the time. People say that hard-wearing materials that are going to last a long time must be sustainable because they will endure for decades, if not centuries. But of course, from an ecological point of view, we just don't have centuries, right? We have a matter of decades, if that. And this is a big problem for architecture, because it means that potentially making a very robust architecture that will last for a long time, but which comes with that blast of embodied carbon in its construction, is no longer a viable model. Longevity, hard-wearingness, solidity, these kind of very seductive values that we've invoked with various material strategies might need to be rethought or abandoned entirely. So an alternative could be an architecture that is actually not tough at all. It's actually quite weak, that requires constant repair and maintenance, but which doesn't come with that front-loaded blast of embodied carbon. What might an architecture of repair be like? Well, let's look at thatch as a quick example. Thatch is an amazing material. It has these sculptural qualities. It's insulating. It's naturally abundant. It even sequesters a little carbon. We don't use thatch very much because it has a high maintenance requirement. A roof like this might need to be replaced every 10 to 15 years. But from an environmental point of view, it would be better to replace this roof every year, forever, with thatch than to build it once out of reinforced concrete. So what would it mean to embrace low-carbon, high-repair design strategies as a norm? And I think a lot of earth architecture kind of already embodies this to some extent. This is the great mosque of Jenne in Mali. Its facade, its architecture is kind of covered with these protruding bundles of rods called torun, which in fact are the built-in scaffolding infrastructure to enable its repair every year, right? This is not just decoration. This is both expressing and enabling a culture of repair to take place. This is a very traditional process, but I think we can see something similar in some urban situations. What about thinking of the lengths that the high-tech architects went to achieve their aesthetic? These blue cranes on top of Richard Rogers's Lloyd's building in London. They're cleaning infrastructure. They're window cleaning cranes. They enable people to constantly clean, repair the facade of the building. But they are also architectural form. They tell a story about what Richard Rogers and the high-tech architects were saying about the future of modernism with this kind of mechanized, steely aesthetic. So if it's possible to think of cleaning as architecture, maybe it's possible to think of maintenance as architecture too.
So one of the things that I really love about expressive maintenance and repair is that it suggests a different kind of respect for those humble custodial tasks. What if we all thought of ourselves as responsible custodians of built fabric? What would our role as architects look like then? What if, in the same way as we talk about a circular economy instead of a linear economy, we reinvented our design process to also be cyclical, with a respect for materials at its center? So instead of a degenerative, extractivist take, make, dispose process, as we've illustrated at the top there, we wrapped our whole design culture around a responsible use of scarce resources, as this circular design process illustrated at the bottom. What would this mean for architecture that's not something that uses materials up, but borrows them from the planet temporarily before giving them back? Now, perhaps one of the most striking examples of this kind of thinking is this housing project by Lendiger Group in Denmark, who took brickwork from the site and clad their new building with it in whole sections of wall. And maybe we'll hear more about this later this morning. Or here's another example that we showed in Oslo by Canadian practice YMD. And this is a structural column which is filled with gravel. But rather than using cement to glue that gravel together, it uses a fabric membrane. And it's packed with the gravel. And so at the end of the sort of useful period of this column, the gravel bag can be unzipped, and the gravel can be returned to the site. And it's only been borrowed. It's in no way degraded. No gravel was harmed in the making of this column. When that column is no longer needed, and it's posted to a new location, then maybe that suggests a new kind of value for architecture, one in which the matter and energy are in this constant cycle, and the value of the architecture is really just in the design itself, rather than that matter being used up. I mean, and I think we'll hear more about circular economy design later, and it's all just sounds very, very sensible. Clearly, the architecture of degrowth is sensible, is possible, and as we said at the beginning, we have the technology. In fact, a lot of it is very, very old. So why aren't we doing it? Well, we're not doing it because growth is working really, really well for some. So this is a really striking graph, and it's of the US, and it's pre-tax income since 1962. And the blue line is the bottom 50% of society. And as you can see, since 1962, the wealth of the bottom 50% has not really changed very much. But the wealth of the top 1%, that red line, has increased enormously. So while the bottom half of society have got no richer, the top 1% have got huge, huge benefits from that economic growth. And the problem is the vested interests of the elite perpetuate inequality and drive GDP growth. Now, they try to tell us that, oh, but it's good for society as a whole, still, this GDP growth. And so this is another graph. This is GDP per capita against the social progress index, which is quite a complicated index that measures all sorts of less kind of monetized benefits. And you can see here that GDP growth does bring some benefits for a bit, but then it levels off really quickly. And it makes it very clear that while sort of we may pursue the economic growth forever, that is not bringing us ever, ever, ever increasing returns and ever increasing social benefits. That's clearly a myth. So what does this mean for architecture? Well, while we architects like to believe that we're these sort of socially minded artists creating beautiful civic value, as this square in London, most of the time, what we're actually creating, and the way that others, perhaps some of our clients, see what we're creating, looks more like this. It's monetary value. It's another great smart cities image. You can see I love them. And in fact, what we're creating is not social vibrancy and social value. What we're creating is money. When we build buildings, not as shelter or as places for people to come together, but as an investment, we are literally building money. So let's illustrate this. This is a map of buildings and land in central London that is owned in overseas tax havens. Why would money in an overseas tax haven want to own property in London? Well, because it's a bloody good investment. This is not an investment advice. So these are some of the new housing estates built in London and the percentage that have been sold to overseas investment. So let's just zoom in on any one. So this is the Manhattan Loft Gardens, 82% of which is owned by overseas investors. And this is a typical flat in the Manhattan Loft Gardens. So you can see it's pretty small, single aspect, sort of a deep plan. And yes, you have a nice view, but, you know, it's fine, I guess. It is certainly not worth £12,000 per square meter. That's just shy of 150,000 Swedish krona per square meter. Clearly, that value is not the value of the use value of living there. That's the value of it as an investment. Let's look at another project. So we have the Circus West. It's the phase 1 of Battersea Power Station. Here we've got 85% owned by overseas investors. And here also, almost half of that is from high corruption jurisdictions. So this isn't just architecture as money. This is architecture as dirty money. And what kind of architecture did this offer to us? What kind of architecture does this money impose on the city? This stunner. Dead facade, no interaction with the surrounding cityscape, and very, 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 very high embodied energy. This is what a really safe investment looks like. And turning homes into commodities affects architecture at all scales and all price points. And this is an image we're familiar with the world over, that sort of capitalist dream of each of us owning our own little castle with our own everything. But the problem is that underlying this is a whole infrastructure of inefficient consumerism. So here, quite literally, underlying, for example, is a small development of 3 homes, and every single bathroom and kitchen is getting its own meters and meters of soil pipe, because God forbid you would want your poop getting mixed up with your neighbors too soon. It's like, it's just ridiculous, and it's just one of so many decisions that get made every day to use more resources than we really need to, so that we can all have our own private stuff.
What a colossal waste of waste pipe. It doesn't have to be this way, right? Here, everybody's insisting on their own toilet infrastructure, and as a result, all those toilets are small, enclosed, and resource intensive. If we relaxed our insistence on owning individual assets, we might live in a very different world with very different toilets. This is Sue Fujimoto's Itsubu public lavatory. Right? It's shared by strangers, and through sharing, it consumes less resources, yet in some ways is more luxurious. This is a metaphor, just in case that wasn't clear, right? This is a metaphor, and yet I think it speaks to something. It speaks to the frustration that we don't share. We don't even share plumbing infrastructure. And as a result, our neighborhoods are atomized into different family units with very little sharing taking place between those units. Why is this? It wasn't that long ago that we used to share better. Take domestic labor, take laundry, right? This is a French municipal lavoir. This is a wash house for doing laundry, and from a time when doing laundry was something that was absolutely done in public space. It was as public as going to church, as going to the market, as going to the pub. It's not much, it's just a trough of water, and yet it has the architectural expression of a small temple or of a kind of town hall. Now, of course, over time, technology changes, domestic labor shifts around, the rise of the nuclear family, the rise of capitalism, the division of domestic life and professional life, and laundry starts to move away from the town square and into homes. But it's still a very visible part of the city, right? You would still see the trace of laundry taking place around you, of that domestic life. But throughout the 20th century and more recently, that trend doesn't stop. It absolutely continues to the point that this is kind of the face of laundry today. completely hidden, not only within the home, but in this case, hidden into a cupboard. So even your own family members are sort of, to some extent, unaware that laundry is taking place. As a result, laundry takes place unseen, hidden away, often by unpaid or very, very low-paid workers, predominantly women. So what would it mean to kind of push back, to give laundry and other forms of domestic life that have been moved away from a shared public existence some civic qualities? Again, well, this is a project we showed in the Oslo Architecture Triennale by Henry Lefroy Brooks, a civic laundrette. And Henry is proposing a kind of rebuilding laundry infrastructure at that civic scale, here given the kind of status that might normally be reserved for a war memorial or a great public sculpture. Similar project by the feminist design collective Edit, this time looking at hoovering, another kind of domestic labor. Very much this is the image of vacuum cleaning that is promoted, a tool for use by one person at a time. And so Edit created a 3-person vacuum cleaner, which could only be used by 3 people in collaboration. And I think we can see this in architecture as well, actually. I think this is what Goldfinger was getting at. When Erno Goldfinger designed Trellick Tower, he didn't hide the hot water boilers away in small cupboards. He created a monumental 3-story boiler room at the top of the tower, which is that big kind of bulge on the side. So giving domestic labor architectural status and one of the best views in London. And we see this, there are other traditions of architectural sharing where architecture has embraced sharing rather than shied away from it. And libraries are a good example of that. But I guess we're asking what other forms of emerging sharing infrastructure could architects and architecture enfranchise and enable? What about libraries of things? Or repair cafes, or what are they called? Like kind of time banks where labor and skills can be exchanged without going through a monetary economy. I mean, the sort of library of things is maybe more popular over here than in other parts of the world, but a world where you don't need your own lawnmower, you don't need your own power drill, because of course you borrow it from a library. Sweden has a reputation for this, even at the scale of a community, but can we even go further? This is a high-rise scheme designed by Karakusevich Carson Architects for, it has shared domestic spaces at the top, but as the bottom, industrial spaces start to mix in with residential. So using sharing at a kind of urban scale to enable manufacturing to continue to take place in a city center. So sharing can bring these huge social and environmental benefits in all sorts of situations. Let's learn from the penguins, who know that when it's cold, it's good to gather together. But the reason we don't share well, the reason that it is rare for architecture to enable sharing, is because that sharing is bad for GDP. Every time you lend a tool, every time you let a guest stay at your house, every time you borrow something from a library, even cook a meal for your partner, you have damaged GDP because something that could have been traded has instead been given freely. And although in resource terms sharing is clearly more efficient, in economic terms it is bad for productivity. But if we agree, for the purposes of this lecture at least, that growth is maybe something we need to be more critical of, then maybe we need to question productivity also. And so in the final leg of this lecture, we want to just show a few examples of architecture which challenges productivity. So let's do that. Maria, this is a project you designed a few years ago. It seems to be a giant trumpet. What on earth is it?
Well, it's a giant trumpet, and it's really just an excuse to do nothing. The client wanted to encourage people to get out into the landscape and to enjoy the landscape. And they're really just these sculptures that encourage people to listen to the landscape. There were a few of them, to listen to the sky, to listen to the water, but just to enable people to take in their surroundings.
So an architectural opportunity to stand somewhere beautiful and do very little, to just sort of absorb nature in a new way. It is what I would call a dépense machine. And this term, dépense, is key to degrowth thinking. It comes from the French artist and philosopher Georges Bataille. And it kind of means energy that you spend on cultural activities that are not productive, not in a servile sense or in an economic sense. So, you know, you have this surplus of energy after you've kind of fed yourself, dressed yourself. What do you do with that energy? Do you invest it in a productive activity, or do you spend it on dépense? And Bataille argues that some of the best things in life are dépense activities, some of the things that make the human experience most meaningful. So things like mourning if someone has died, many of our hobbies, prayer, meditation, play, spectacles, the arts, romance, and certainly sexual pleasure. Dépense could be something as simple as taking the scenic route home rather than the most direct route. You could think of it as activities which have a purely cultural goal rather than something that needs an external goal to justify itself. Tattoos are a good example. You get a tattoo on your arm, it's lost all its value. A tattoo is not an economic investment. You can't sell it for a profit once you've bought it. But there are maybe examples in architecture as well. I think maypoles or midsummer poles are an interesting example. Structures that are made for a cultural purpose, where there's no external objective. And this is a project from the Oslo Triennale, which does something similar. The Wind House by Arkitekter Uncomfortable Workshop, a structure that they build every year in Hungary to mark the arrival of spring. But no kind of external goal here, simply an opportunity for some families to get together, make a small piece of architecture that brings them together as a sort of social act. And this is maybe the most radical example. The Shinnekin-sengu ceremony in Japan, where for thousands of years, the people of my prefecture have demolished and rebuilt the Ise shrine, not because it needed repairing, but because the process of making architecture itself becomes something that is a festival in its own right. Architecture that needs no external justification. And I guess the last structure, as we sort of move towards the conclusion, is the simplest of all. A cairn. A cairn is a collectively built piece of wayfinding infrastructure, simple yet recognizable column of rocks, made and maintained organically by travelers as they pass. You pick up a rock, you place it on the cairn so that someone in the future will see the cairn. There is no exchange of money taking place. There is no commissioning clients. No one has decided where the cairns should go. In economic terms, you can't own them. You can't sell them. They're completely valueless. And yet, if you are lost in the fog on the mountain, you can maybe make out the shape of a cairn in the gloom and find your way to the right path and back down the hill to safety. So something that has no economic value can save your life. And what could be more valuable than that? But the pursuit of growth is taking us down a different path entirely. Something invented as a tool of war has become an all-consuming beast, commodifying culture in its path. It was the pursuit of economic growth that led the English to invade Ireland and then to colonize many other nations around the world. It was this that meant that English is now such a widely spoken language. Our privilege in giving this lecture in our home tongue rests on a history of expansionist colonization in the pursuit of infinite economic growth. Bjarke Ingels, or are you going to say this bit?
I could say this bit.
Okay.
Bjarke Ingels and others want to build habitats on Mars. Why? Because he's not an idiot. He understands that infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet. And rather than reduce our dependence on growth, he would rather deal with the finite part of that planet to colonize another planet. And this is the same impetus. It's the same cycle, and we must break it. I think we all know that the route to truly sustainable good life is not in colonizing the red planet. It's in caring for our blue planet. It lies in industry and architecture that doesn't consume the world's resources, but respectfully borrows and reconfigures them. It relies on not relating to architecture through through nature to exploitation, but through cultivation, not by relating to each other through domination, but through cooperation, and through not always demanding more, but recognizing that if we're just sensible and careful and fair, we already have more than enough.
Thank you.
The end.